One of the important things in working in a museum is you've got to come up with solutions to every problem because artefacts are like people. They all have their idiosyncrasies, they all have their special needs, and they all like you to give them your full and undivided attention. And they're a bit like politicians, except shipwreck objects don't get paid and don't have superannuation benefits. But this is, if you want to see the picture of from Pelsart's Unlucky Voyage, just go upstairs because the State Library has a copy of the book. And it's a depiction of the dreaded massacre on Beacon Island. And of the 250 people on board the Batavia, by the time Pelsart got back, there were only 125 left. The others had been killed with either or just being held under the water and drowned. And drowning is actually quite pleasant because once you relax, you just got to relax, and as you start to go hypoxic and the carbon dioxide level builds up and you can't breathe anymore because of the water in your lungs, you chill out and you know you're going to die, and the rest is history. But so I really owe my professional life to other people's death and misfortune. So I'm very grateful to them. But a lot of people say, well, what's conservation all about? I don't really believe that what you do in your work can make any real difference. Prove it to me. Jeremy Green, recently retired head of maritime archaeology, said, I don't believe in conservation. You can't prove it. I felt like saying I don't believe in archaeology. You can't prove it. But that's nice to know that someone's mobile phone works. The former dean of St George's Cathedral, John Shepherd, would get up at the start of a concert and say, mobile phone policy in concerts is very simple. Please leave them on, because if God wants you to have a chat, he'll just call you on your phone, and as the call comes in, that's a $350 donation towards the restoration fund. It guarantees that people turn their phones off. But here are two astrolabes from the Batavia. The astrolabes were used for determining your latitude. The one on the right is obviously in good condition. The one on the left is pretty stuffed. But the reason for the difference in behaviour is that... Where's the button gone? Anyway, the one on the left was exposed to full surf for 350 years. And the one on the right was stuck inside a lump of iron cannonball concretion. And so it was protected from oxygen. The bacteria didn't attack the bronze because it was biologically toxic. So when it came out of the concretion, it only needed a few weeks of desalination. The one on the left needed 18 months of treatment. And so that's what good preventive conservation is about. If you were an artefact and we put you in an ideal storage environment, you'd last for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, you're not made of metal or ivory, so you'll just decay. But the timbers on the Batavia ended up being really quite decayed. You can see in this image the transom beams going there, and that's the curve of the fashion piece. And that is cut out of one solid piece of oak. And that that bit of oak began growing as an acorn in Poland in 1315. And so it was about 300 odd years when it became a dead oak tree and the stern of the Batavia. But in the ocean, underneath the coral, underneath the protective blanket of marine concretion, the bacteria eat cellulose. Why? Well, there's nothing else to eat. Uber Eats hadn't been developed. And so the bacteria say, Mum, what's for breakfast? Oak. What's for lunch? Oak. What's for dinner? Oak. What's for snacks? Oak. Just shut up and eat it. And so they did as they were told. How perfect to have bacteria as your children, because they do as they're told. And they eat everything that's put in front of them. And so as a result, after 350 years of decay, many of the timbers had up to, 350, 450% water in them. And before you start saying, you can't have more than 100% of anything, yes, you can. It's like statistics. It's like economics. It depends what your base measurement is. So if your base measurement is the dry weight of wood after you've evaporated the water, you end up with 450% water in it, which means that if you let that timber dry, something like this happens. The timber starts off looking, I look good. And then as the water goes out, it starts to shrink and collapse. And then just go, and you dried out waterlogged timber. It's a bit like going away for a long holiday overseas and forgetting you left the carrots out in the bottom drawer of the fridge. You come back and you cannot get a carrot to go back being nice and crunchy after it's been desiccated. So what we do is we impregnate them with a waterlogged with a water-soluble polymer called polyethylene glycol. And before you start saying, I don't know, I don't believe in all these organic things, hand up those who do not use any face cream. Well, I'm sorry, men, shame on you. Shame, because you should use face cream to moisturise your face. Think of the women in your lives. What do they have to kiss? Do they want to kiss rough old leather? No, they want something nice and smooth and firm. So what happens is that Sod's Law says that if a pump can break down at the worst possible time, it will. So we're moving a load of timbers, that's me by the way, we're moving timbers down to the other lab in Cliff Street in Fremantle, and the pump broke down. And PEG freezes when it's cold. And so we had to get in, and once the solution goes over the top of your gumboots, you really don't care. And it was fine, we got the job done, but when it came to take the boots off, they were stuck to my feet. So I had to lie on my back inside the external shower until the hot water dissolved the PEG, and then it ran all the way down the gumboots, up my legs, and then I could take my legs off. But the interesting thing is, here you can see the adze marks. So some of the Batavia timbers were adzed, and there you can just see the saw marks. So some of them were pit sawn, others were trimmed with adzes. And Jeremy Green said to me, oh, you've cracked my timbers. I said, no, I didn't. The crack was there originally. And he said, prove it. Well, I just happened to have a friend come in from London, who was an archaeologist, who said, oh, that's typical 300-year-old crack in oak that's dried from being set up as a green timber in a ship. That is not conservation, that's archaeology. And the late Stan Wilson, who was the museum's honorary numismatist, came in one day and said, look, I've got this coin, it's got a bit of a crack in it. And I thought, well, that's not meant to happen. And so the long and the short of it is, that's the outside of the coin after treatment, and that's the inside of the coin. And this is the analysis. The outside part had the right amount of silver in it, but the inner part had half as much. It had a lot of tin and quite a bit of copper and lead. It was a genuine 1753 forgery. 1768. Look, and it's all, if you know your Latin, which I think many of you in the audience will, Fis de Shipwrecks Gel means I'm King Philip II of Spain. I'm grateful to God because it's good being king and not a peasant. And this is one of my coins minted in the Spanish mint in Gelderland. Why did Philip II create his own forged coins? Because he was running out of dosh. Waging war to try and convert the Protestant Dutch to being Catholic cost a lot of money. And he was going broke. So he did what Paul Keating would have called a fiscal adjustment. He doubled his money overnight. And iron cannon, all artefacts on a shipwreck site are really very talkative, except you have to learn the language of decay. And so I look at myself in the mirror every morning, as I do, because I'm a gentleman. I shave, before breakfast. It's the right thing to do. And so you look for the signs of decay. And here you can see this cannon has a thick lump of concretion on it, and there a very thin layer. This cannon was actually accidentally dropped during recovery and sat in the bottom of the ocean in the Abrolhos Islands for 7 years, waiting for the government to get enough money to go back and pick it up. But the interesting thing was, here is the extent of corrosion of the guns, and this is this one. 50 millimetres of graphitization. That means if you had a big mouth and could go, you'd bite in 50 millimetres before you hit solid iron. Now, we don't normally recommend people go along biting cannon because you get sore teeth. But what I found was, I asked people, why are these ones down near the stern 44 millimetres, these 29, 24, 18? Well, we now know the reason why the 50 millimetre corrosion happened, because it had been deconcreted, because it was dropped and left there for 7 to 10 years. And that is the increase, doubles the amount of decay in 7 years compared with 350 when you lose the protective concretion on it. So what do you do on a wreck site? Leave the concretion alone. Go away. And I like order. I'm a Liberal. I'm a chemist. And so what I did was I went and plotted the results of the extent of decay over the distance from the stern. And lo and behold, there was a lovely curve. But chemists don't like curves. We like straight lines. So I went and found that if you plot the square root of the distance from the stern, your decay pattern is linear. And so these are the average corrosion rates. This is the gun that, not quite sure why that doesn't work, the gun that got deconcreted, but yeah, so that's the story. And I was able, from Pat Baker's underwater 3D imaging, to work out that the reason why the cannon were corroding in the way they were, it was to do with the underwater topography of the site and the amount of turbulence that the waves were getting, because decay is determined by the flux of dissolved oxygen. So, in the ocean off Rottnest, you've got the same roughly dissolved oxygen content as you have in the Abrolhos. But on the Morning Reef, the waves are going crash. So they're bringing a greater flux of corroding energy in the oxygen to the metal, and therefore they corrode faster. So if you want to be decayed, go to the Abrolhos. Whoops, we'll just go back talking about decay. This was a classic. Do not trust people in the eastern states with your artefacts. This dead gentleman, one of the victims of the mutiny, Sydney knows best. Of course they do. That's where the Prime Ministers, the last 5 of them, come from. I want a WA Prime Minister before I die. We haven't had one since John Curtin. Let's run a campaign for a new form of federal government in which we have Prime Ministers rotating from the states. Because I'm fed up with Sydney. And so, anyway, they made a showcase for him to travel for the bicentennial of New South Wales exhibition, and he didn't fit because they assumed that he would be a normal 17th century Dutch person before they got very tall. And so what we did, we just moved the shin bones sideways and made him fit. But interestingly, they'd done a reconstruction of, facial reconstruction like they do on forensic shows. And there was a Dutch Minister of State coming through, and I thought, I've seen your face before. And he said, no, you haven't. I said, I think I have. And it turns out that I had in the reconstruction of this dead man's face. He was a dead ringer for the live Dutch minister, whose name was De Vries. His name was De Vries. He was one of the 2 Dutchmen who were over 6'2" tall on the Batavia. The other one had got off sick in Cape Town. This man, we know who he was. And when I sent a PowerPoint image of the dead man and his face, along with a photograph of the cabinet minister, he said, "You're right." So you just never know, what you're going to find when you're giving a tour around the museum. But one of the things is, even Channel 9 are never first when it comes to shipwrecks in 1872. Why? Because they weren't around, contrary to their self-belief. But what happens as you go through time? An ordinary ship starts to lose its masts and bits and pieces and ends up looking like that at the bottom. And so that is a view of Dr Mac McCarthy. And look, he's very trim, but he doesn't have bathers. He always dives in his jocks. But that is our museum workboat. Not fancy. It's not like in the current movies. This was what we worked on from the Xantho, and we were working on hookers That is, your compressed air supply lines, and so you have a demand valve in your mouth and you're working away. And then all of a sudden you go, no air. And that means the compressor has run out of fuel. And so you go up to the surface, I need more air. And the museum couldn't afford wetsuit tops, so I dived in a jumper, and Neil North couldn't afford a top. He had just trousers, so he was wearing gloves, and there we were doing our in situ corrosion assessment of the engine. It turned out it is and was the world's only surviving example of the first mass-produced high-pressure marine steam engine. So before you all go, who cares? It is maritime heritage's equivalent of the first mass-produced car. So if you bought the first T-model Ford, you'd be paying many, many hundreds of millions of dollars. What do? We picked it up for nothing. Because Penn of Greenwich had to develop these mass number of engines for the Crimean War in 1858. So what's changed? Nothing. Nothing. Except it was the British fighting the Russians, then now it's Ukrainians fighting the Russians. Go Ukraine. And anyway, so that's what the engine looked like on the right. Lots of fish, and we took the engine away, left the stern, and we were going to recover it, but we didn't. We ran out of money. And but anyway, it's been preserved on the bottom of the ocean in Port Gregory. And for those of you who are not familiar with Port Gregory, it's north of Jarrow, and it's where the cops found all those crooks smuggling the drugs. And how did they find it out? Shoes. The criminals were wearing leather shoes in the men's toilets. And so the caravan park owner thought, hello, normally people just wear thongs. And so they rang up the local Rozzers and they sent a team of a posse of undercover cops, and then got them all, and the goods. So we had this 7.5 tonne load of corroded iron, and Mac on the left wanted to know what was inside the valve chests and how corroded were they. Well, the museum didn't have an endoscope, but one of my friends who was a surgeon at Fremantle Hospital did. So I rode up at lunchtime on my bicycle, borrowed an endoscope, then we put it down and filmed the inside of the engine, cleaned it up with absolute alcohol, and I rode it back. That's how you do things with mates. And what is the point of pulling an engine apart? The answer is you find out stuff that you never believed, never knew was there. Here is one line and there is another corrosion line. One relates to the angle of the ship as it was recovered, and the other line relates to the angle on which it went down. No one, when you're an archaeologist, you can only see and judge what's in front of you. So clearly the ship was found over on this angle, but it sank on that side. And after about 14 years, it went, oh, that's better. A bit like your back. But you can't complain about life and how we're aging, because we all are. And the good thing about aging is we know and we can record it, document it, because once we're dead, it really doesn't matter because, you can't get any older. And so, but Dirk Hartog left behind his plate in 1616, up on Cape Inscription. And that's a picture upstairs in the State Library of what it looked like in about 1890. Pretty corroded and damaged. But in 1697, Willem de Vlaming came along, picked it up and said, right, I'll flatten my plate, copy the inscription out, say, I was here too, yeah, g'day, and he left. And then Louis de Freycinet came along and picked up the de Vlaming plate, got shipwrecked in Ascension Island, and then recovered the plate. And of course, the wonderful Sir Paul Hasluck brought it to WA after the French gave it to the Australian government as a thank you for all the deaths of Australian troops in World War I and World War II who saved France. And this is a view of that plate. There's lots of it missing, but an awful lot of cracks. And why? That's because pewter is a bit brittle, and when it's been hammered and not annealed, it becomes even more brittle. And we were able to work out that in the took about 14 years of sitting on a post with the katabatic winds going boom, 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 twisting the pewter until it started going cracking. And then we took this plate down to the synchrotron, and all along these lines where it had cracked, we found strontium. Now, strontium is a natural element in seawater, and strontium is selectively absorbed on corroding tin oxides. And so we could work out hundreds of years later exactly what decay was due to its original in situ location on Dirk Hartog Island. So that is pretty cool. And that's what the plate looks like now. And I can't believe, these young whippersnappers, at the age of 35 and 45, who said to me, oh, I can't do a double shift. I get too tired. So, poor little doodums. So I did 3 days of double shifts, working 16 hours a day, just normal. And at 3 o'clock one morning, this is what I saw. And I just went, why? Why was I so excited? Hey, I'm into metals. And this stuff is, germanium is the red, and you can see that there is, look, there's the germanium all around. They're grains of the crystals inside the plate. And these grains are different in shape to these ones. And the green is the arsenic impurities in the lead. That meant we were able to get the complete structure of the de Vlaming plate without touching it. All we did was hit it with 92 million X-ray photons per second. So I wouldn't recommend being a Hartog plate and being shoved in a synchrotron beam because you die. But the synchrotron picks up this stuff, and it's about 0.0001% impurities. But it showed the whole structure. Oh, I was very excited. In fact, I paid for everybody's grog that night, which cost me about $164. But one of the things is that thanks to the wreck of HMS Sirius that you can see here on Norfolk Island, we nearly lost Sydney. Rats! But one of the crew was an artist, and so once he got ashore, he sat down on Norfolk Island, on the shore, and painted his ship being wrecked. I mean, you don't need Channel 9, or Channel 2, or Four Corners, anything. You just need a good artist. So this is Nepean Island, and that's Phillip Island, and this is on March the 19th, 1790. And so I thought, beauty. We've got hundreds of bits of cast iron ballast. I'll be able to check my corrosion measurements, because McCarthy asked me, what do these values mean? I said, I don't know. And he said, you're useless. And I said, well, I don't know the mechanism. And he said, well, bloody well find out. And so what I did was we drilled into all these ballast pigs. They're about a yard long and 6 inches square. I thought I'd toss in that flexible imperial measurement for you. And what I found is that the ship is wrecked and lies under the surf. And what it means is that when you're diving and doing your measurements, a wave comes through and you hold on until your knuckles go white, and then you get sucked off the wreck back in towards the shore, and then the wave passes and you get sucked back to where your meters are, and you just carry on. So I have scars on my wrists and other parts of my body to attest to the ferocity of the wreck. These days, you wouldn't be allowed to do it, but we just did it as a job. And the reason why the energy on Norfolk Island is so strong is there's that little bump, and there's a topographic map, and you've got water 2 kilometres deep within a few k's of Norfolk Island. So where's that energy going to go? Boom, onto the wreck. And so what we did, the anchor was being recovered, so we stuck some sacrificial anodes on it, and it was pre-treated on the seabed, so the anchor was recovered from the most corrosive wreck site in Australia, and it's the best anchor preservation. Why? Because we treated it for a year on the seabed. One of the challenges of monitoring that wreck is where they put the anchor while waiting for a tank to be built with steel from New Zealand. Well, what would you do? You have the guys filleting all their fish on the jetty. And so as you're doing your measurements, frames and guts are being thrown in around you, and the sharks come in to eat that. And so you sort of go on, piss off, to the sharks, and they just leave you alone because you're covered in a wetsuit and it's too much mess. And so there we are using compressed air drills, drill through the concretion and find out what we've got on the inside. And basically that thing with my hands around it is a cannon, and we removed my body weight of chloride out of it in 2.5 years while it was sitting on the seabed. And that meant that we were able to get the cannon on exhibition in 6 months instead of 7 years. So it works. And one of the things about all the ballast is that these are the number of millimetres of corrosion in 200 years. I thought, in my job as editor of a corrosion journal, people have been complaining there is no government funding for doing long-term corrosion studies in shallow water. I thought, I've done it. And the long and the short of it is, the cast iron from Norfolk Island gives you a corrosion rate of about 0.5 millimetres a year. And that's a lot. But it means in the splash zone, we can actually tell you how fast steel will corrode on all the Northwest Gas Shelf installations when they run out of protection. So we know how long they'll last. And people say, oh, well, how long did you run your experiment for? 205 years? Bugger off. And one of the things from the carronade was when we got it ashore, you can't really see, it's very dark, but on my left hand is the tompion, the wooden plug that was, hammered in to the muzzle of the gun. And behind it was a ball of wadding. And so as the cannon would be going up and down, and down, there was a ball inside, and it would rock back and forward and keep the ball clean and ready to fire at anyone who happened to be in the road. And look, my time has come for this talk, not to an end, though we know not when we go on to the next journey. But this watch from the wreck of the Pandora, does everyone know about the Pandora? No? Well, for those of you who know it, just go to sleep. But the Pandora was the warship that was sent out by the Brits to go and bring back those dastardly mutineers from the Bounty who chucked Captain Bligh off his ship and went and had the time of their lives in Tahiti. So they caught up with the mutineers that hadn't gone to Pitcairn and brought them back in a cage. And as they were going through Torres Strait, of course, what does the ship do? Hits a reef and then sinks. And the watch sank with the ship. And so John Carpenter spent a long time working on this, but this is after, partway through treatment, after we'd got it open, and this is at the end of the treatment. And that's the same watch. And this is fire-gilded brass, and there's the name of the manufacturer, J&J Jackson of London, watch number 9866. So we were able to find out it was sold to the surgeon on board the Pandora, and you might say, well, that's the end of the story, so what? Go back to sleep. But that man, that surgeon, when he wasn't treating sick people, he was doing science. And he was recording the pulse of the convicts, not the convicts, the mutineers, and the officers and the crew when they were well and sick. And because on the reverse side of the watch, there was a second sweep hand. It is one of the earliest watches with a tick, 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 tick. And so when he got back from England, got back to England after being shipwrecked, he wrote up his observations, and so far as we know, it's the first paper in the world to record the correlation between pulse and temperature and health and sickness. And that is the watch that was used in that record-breaking bit of science in 1792. And that is where the story ends. So, thank you. If you looked carefully, you would have seen that the cannon were recovered basically from under silt, from fine sand. And when you have just a shallow coverage of sand, so that it's not enough to be totally anaerobic, you get no concretion, because the bronze is biologically toxic, which is why you put copper-based paints or copper on your hull of your boat as an antifoul. Whereas iron actively promotes marine growth. And why? It's because the mitochondria in the marine organisms need iron for their energy to grow. And that's why, if you look at the difference in colour of duck meat, it's all brown because the duck's breasts and legs are going all the time. Chooks just wander around going and turkeys, well, they do similar sort of stuff. And that's why their breasts are white, because they have low iron content. Whereas if you eat a person, then we're like pigs, and so we have pink meat in general because we don't have enough mitochondria. Me, no. What I worked for the museum till 7 years ago, and now I do honorary work for them. So I still solve problems for conservation, but I don't get paid. No, the idea these days is they leave that material so that as you swim over the Batavia site, you can still see where the wreck was, still see the majority of the cannon and several anchors, so it's unmistakably the spot. But when I first went up there, I was profoundly disturbed by the presence of the dead. And so, being in charge of Geraldton and the other regional museums, I organised a multi-faith service, and at dawn, some Baha'is, Catholics, Baptists, Anglicans, Catholics, Jewish, the lot, went out in their boats and had a hallowing service. And since then, there are only about half a dozen ghosts left on Beacon Island, and they're quite happy to be there. And all the angry ones that Hugh Edwards described in his book, The Island of Angry Ghosts, they've all gone. And some of my colleagues said, you have no right to interfere with an archaeological site. And I said, pardon me, how would you like it if you were stuck on the Abrolhos Islands for over 350 years and no one gave us stuff? The least I could do was to help them complete their journey and go home. And so, it's really, really important when working on shipwrecks and working on Aboriginal rock art sites that you communicate with the spirits of the place, ask for permission to do your measurements, explain what you're doing, and then that's why I always get good results. And one of the elders was saying to me when I was up on the climbing man site up in the Burrup, and he said, how are you holding on? And I said, I'm not. Because you need one hand for the pH meter, another for the electrode, and you just call out the numbers and someone on the other side of the gully writes them down, and a sketch of where you've done your measurements. And he said, Peter said, oh, it's all right, I can see my ancestors are holding you onto the rock. And so if you do work of a cultural nature and you're not aware of the spiritual environment, well, it's a bit like fluorine chemists. We used to say there are two types of fluorine chemists, the quick and the unsuccessful. And so in materials conservation research and working on rock art, if you ignore the spirits, your electrodes will break, the measurements will fail, the battery on the multimeter will run out of power, everything bad will happen. But if you do the right thing, you get good results.